I was not sworn in beneath banners or before a crowd. My induction took place in a narrow antechamber beneath the Munitorum's upper vaults, where the ceiling dripped condensation and the lumen strips flickered as if uncertain they wished to continue existing. The room smelled of dust, ground parchment, old incense, and the faint copper tang of recycled air that had passed through too many lungs. A clerk supervisor, his robes threadbare at the cuffs, his eyes replaced with augmetic lenses that clicked softly as they focused, read my designation aloud from a slate. He spoke my name once, mispronounced it, and never attempted it again. After that, I was a number. The number was stamped onto a strip of plasteel and hung around my neck like a devotional charm. They gave me tools instead of blessings. A data slate with a cracked corner, a metal stamp engraved with the sigil of supply authorization, a block of ink so thick it smelled faintly sweet and rotten, like something once alive. I was told these were extensions of my body now, and that losing any of them would be treated as self-mutilation. The clerk supervisor recited regulations in a monotone cadence that mimicked prayer. Each clause was numbered, sub-numbered, cross-referenced. Each one closed a door I had not yet realized was open. I felt the weight of them settle onto my shoulders, invisible but crushing like a leaden robe. The oath itself was short. I promised accuracy. I promised obedience. I promised to trust the ledger over my senses, the seal over my conscience, the order over the outcome. When I hesitated, just a pause, a breath taken too loudly, the augmetic lenses whirred and fixed on me. The supervisor leaned forward, and I smelled stale recaf on his breath. Hesitation, he said, as the seed of error. I spoke the final words quickly after that, my voice swallowed by the damp stone walls. The records annex became my world. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched into the gloom, stacked with data slates, parchment rolls, and cogitator terminals whose screens glowed a sickly green. The sound was constant, the low hum of machines thinking too slowly, the scratch of quills, the distant clank of servitors being guided along their tracks. The servitors unnerved me most. Once, they had been clerks too, I was told, efficient ones at least. Now they shuffled past with metal grafted into their skulls, purity seals dangling from their chests, their mouths moving soundlessly as if still reciting regulations they could no longer understand. The air was thick enough to taste. Every breath carried mildew from the lower vaults, oil from the machinery, and the faint ash of burned incense. My fingers were always grimy by the end of a shift, stained black from ink and dust no matter how often I wiped them on my robe. The lumen strips overhead flickered irregularly, plunging entire aisles into shadow for seconds at a time. In those moments I felt watched, not by people, but by the institution itself, by the cogitators that logged every keystroke, by the purity seals that fluttered whenever I passed, as if whispering warnings to one another. Training was not instruction so much as correction. I learned by making mistakes and surviving them. A misaligned stamp earned me a strike recorded in red ink. A misfiled requisition form earned me a written reprimand that I had to copy out by hand 100 times, each copy checked for errors. I learned quickly that mistakes were not opportunities to improve, they were moral failings. The ledger did not care why an error occurred. It only recorded that it had. The ledger was perfect. People were not. I watched other new clerks falter. One man older, with shaking hands, forgot to log a crate transfer before the end of shift. The next day, his desk was empty, wiped clean as if he had never existed. A servitor worked there instead, its augmetic fingers moving with precise, inhuman speed. No one spoke his name. Names were inefficient. As days blurred into shifts, I began to understand the true hierarchy. Above us were supervisors, above them auditors, above them officers whose doors I would never see. Below us were numbers, troop counts, ration tallies, casualty projections. Somewhere far beyond the walls, those numbers corresponded to living beings. I knew this intellectually. But here, in the annex, the numbers felt more real than flesh. Ink was permanent. Blood dried. Every morning began with the litany of accuracy. We stood at our desks, hands resting on our stamps, and recited it while a vox speaker crackled overhead. Blessed is the correct figure. Cursed is the discrepancy. The words burrowed into my thoughts. I caught myself murmuring them under my breath while filing forms, while eating my ration paste, while trying unsuccessfully to sleep in the dormitory assigned to junior clerks. Even my dreams were lists and columns, endless lines of figures stretching into darkness. At night, when the shift siren finally released us, I lingered sometimes in the annex, pretending to double-check entries. The silence after hours was worse than the noise. The machines continued to hum, and the servitors continued their patrols, but the human sounds were gone. In that quiet, I felt small and terribly exposed. I ran my fingers along the edge of the shelves, feeling the grooves worn smooth by generations of hands. How many of them had stood where I stood, believing, as I briefly did, that diligence might protect them. On one such night, a cogitator terminal flickered and displayed an error code. A minor one, easily corrected. My heart raced as if I had been accused of heresy. I fixed it, logged the correction, and stamped the confirmation with shaking hands. Only then did I realize I had been holding my breath. Relief washed over me, thin and sour. I laughed once, quietly, and the sound echoed too loudly. I did not laugh again. By the end of my first cycle, my back ached from hunching over the desk, and my eyes burned from the glow of the screens. But worse than the physical discomfort was the creeping realization that the building had taught me something. I no longer thought first of people when I saw a requisition. I thought of codes of compliance, of how cleanly the stamp would fall on the page. The ledger mattered more than the living. That truth settled into me like sediment, layer by layer, until it was part of my foundation. I did not yet know how much that would cost me. But even then, beneath the flickering lumen and the watching cogitators, I felt the walls closing in, not all at once, but patiently, as if they had all the time in the world. The petitions began before dawn chimes, because dawn in a hive is not a sunrise so much as a bureaucratic suggestion. There was no natural light in the Munitorum district, only the pallid glow of luminar rays and the occasional flare of a distant furnace stack staining the ceiling, vents a sick orange. I woke to the dormitory siren with the taste of ration paste still clinging to my teeth, my throat dry from recycled air. The corridor outside our bunks smelled of whetstone disinfectant and the saw sweat of bodies pressed too close for too long. We filed out in silence, boots scuffing over grit that never truly left the floors, and I joined the stream of clerks moving toward the annex like blood, returning to a heart that did not care if we lived. On the way, I passed the petitioner's hall. I had seen it from a distance on my first day, a heavy set of doors engraved with devotional script and bolted with iron. I had assumed it was ceremonial. In truth, it was an intake throat, a place where need was fed into the machine. That morning, the doors were open, and the sound hit me like a physical force, voices layered over voices, a constant restless murmur punctuated by shouts, sobs, the occasional sharp bark of an enforcer's command. The smell followed damp clothing, unwashed skin, cheap incense, blood that had dried and been re-wet by sweat. A line, no, many lines, coiled through the hall like a living thing, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath towering statues of robed saints whose stone eyes stared down without pity. Petitioners clutched paper forms in both hands, some with edges worn soft from being handled too often, others held metal tags stamped with unit codes, some carried nothing at all, only the expression of someone who had already been told no, so many times that the word had become a bruise. I tried not to look. That is what the annex trained you to do, to see only the portion of a person that could be transcribed. But the hall forced itself into my vision. A guardsman stood near the wall with his arm in a crude splint, uniform stained with old mud and something darker. He stared at the floor as if ashamed to be asking for anything. Beside him, a widow, her hair shaved in mourning strips, a threadbare veil pinned with a small aquila, held a petition for death benefits. The paper trembled in her hand like a wounded bird. A quartermaster, eyes bloodshot and wild, paced in place, muttering supply codes under his breath like a charm against starvation. We were told, repeatedly, that petitioners were not our responsibility. The clerk supervisor said it as if he were offering comfort. You do not save them, he told us. You make them legible. You translate disorder into form. That is mercy enough. Then he assigned me to the counter. My station was a narrow booth, built into the wall like a confession niche. A plasteel grille separated me from the hall. There was a slot at chest height for papers, narrow enough that no one could fit a hand through. Above the grille hung a small shrine, a flickering votive candle behind glass, a strip of parchment inscribed with the litany of correct filing, and a purity seal that had yellowed with age. The candle's smoke made my eyes water. The desk inside smelled of ink, grease, and the faint metallic tang of the stamp pressed into my palm. When I sat, the hall beyond the grille surged closer, the first petitioners shuffling forward as if pulled by invisible chains. The queue never truly ended, it only changed faces. A worn sign above the counter read, Frasha Peluki Ovabiel Pulias Welbi Iadi, Disodia Esalusen. I had been taught the process. Step 1, receive the form. Step 2, verify the code against the cogitator registry. Step 3, stamp receipt. Step 4, file for review. Step 5, dismiss the petitioner with the appropriate phrase. There were approved phrases for everything. Your request has been received. Your request is pending verification. Your request is denied due to improper formatting. I learned to speak them without inflection. The first petition was simple requisition for additional boot soles for a trench unit. The guardsman slid the paper through the slot, his fingers trembling. The form was smudged, likely filled out in rain or mud. He had done his best, but the unit code was written in an incorrect format, one digit too many. My training told me what to do. Denny, stamp, improper formatting, send him away. I hesitated, just a beat. I looked at his face through the grille, thin, unshaven, eyes sunken with exhaustion. He did not beg. He only waited, as if waiting had become his default state. The compliance adept appeared at my shoulder as if summoned by my pause. I had not heard him approach. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged. His robe was crisp, his collar lined with devotional script. A small cog-tooth symbol hung from his neck. He leaned in close enough that his breath warmed my ear. Compassion, he whispered, is an inefficiency. His gloved hand rested on the edge of my desk. I noticed the purity seals attached to his sleeve, small strips stamped with wax, each one representing a completed disciplinary action. He smelled of antiseptic and incense, like pain made holy. I stamped the form. I am Pierre Farm TNG. The noise of the stamp was loud in the booth, a gunshot of finality. I slid the paper back through the slot. Your request is denied due to improper formatting, I said, voice steady in a way I did not feel. The guardsman stared at the stamp as if it were a wound. Then he nodded once, stiffly, and stepped away. The line behind him shifted forward immediately, swallowing his absence. I watched him disappear into the crowd, and something in my chest tightened, an invisible cord pulled taut. The petitions kept coming, bandage requests, filter cartridges, ammunition allotments, replacement bayonets, emergency ration increases. Some forms were soaked with blood, some were written on scraps of packaging, desperate improvisations made by people who did not have access to proper paper. Those were denied automatically. Some were perfect, crisp, clean, stamped correctly, and those too were often denied for reasons I did not fully understand. Priority classification, pending sanctity review, supply reallocation. With each denial, the hall grew louder. People began to argue, not with me, most never saw my face clearly behind the grille, but with one another, shoving and snapping like animals fighting over the last scraps of meat. An old man collapsed near the back of the line, and no one moved to help because moving out of line meant losing your place. A woman screamed at the enforcers when they tried to remove him, insisting he deserved his petition heard even if he was dying. The enforcers struck her with a shock baton, and the sound was a wet crack followed by a choked gasp. The line shuddered and then closed ranks again. I was supposed to ignore it. The litany of correct filing did not include provisions for mercy. My job was to take the pain in the hall and translate it into tidy, stamped boxes in the annex. But the hall refused to remain abstract. A widow came forward with death benefit forms. Her hands were raw, fingers red and cracked. She slid her papers through the slot, and I saw, before my eyes could stop themselves, that the forms were annotated in the margins with small notes. Not prayers, not codes, little personal details. He liked sweet recaf. He whistled when he polished his kit. He promised to come home. Those details were not permitted. They did not belong in the ledger. They were noise, the compliance, adept's presence returned like a shadow. Extraneous notation, he murmured. Impure. I should have denied her. I should have stamped, non-compliant. I should have sent her away to rewrite her grief into acceptable terms. Instead, I reached for my quill and, carefully, quickly, copied the essential information onto a clean form, omitting the notes. My heart hammered as if I were committing a crime. Technically I was. Unauthorized transcription, but it meant her petition could proceed without being rejected outright. It was a small mercy, an inefficiency. I slid the clean copy back through the slot with my stamp of receipt and kept the original with its human notes hidden beneath my ledger. The widow did not smile. She only bowed her head slightly and moved on, clutching the approved paper, as if it might still contain her husband's ghost. For a moment, I felt something almost like pride. Then the compliance, adept's hand closed around my shoulder with gentle, terrible certainty. You are learning, he said, but you must learn correctly. His voice was calm. That calm frightened me more than shouting. By mid-shift, the petitioner's hall had become a pressure vessel. The murmuring rose into angry chanting, "Suply, Supply!" The enforcer's batons crackled. I heard the sharp report of a shock round being fired, and then a wet thud. Someone screamed, high and ragged, and the scream did not stop quickly enough. The clerk supervisor walked past the booths, expression flat. "Maintain throughput," he called. "Delays are treason." I stamped faster. My wrist ached. Ink smeared on my fingers. I stopped seeing faces and started seeing form fields. Pod, requies typpruitlssapprovl stamp. The grill became a mercy, a barrier that kept the hall's desperation from touching me almost. But sound travels through metal. Smell travels through slots. Humanity finds its way through cracks. Near the end of the shift, a quartermaster reached the booth. He was tall, gaunt, with eyes too bright. His uniform was patched with mismatched fabric, and his fingers were stained with ink and grease. He shoved a thick bundle of forms through the slot so hard the papers bent. "Read them." He hissed, read them properly. His forms were in order, perfectly formatted, correctly stamped, codes aligned. He had done everything right. The request was for ammunition resupply to a frontline emplacement. Urgent, high priority. I typed the code into the cogitator. The screen flickered. A red line of text appeared. Request demand EPROLOKTUN. The denial was not mine. It came from above, an invisible hand adjusting fate. I could do nothing. The cogitator would not allow override. I stared at the screen, feeling cold. Outside, the quartermaster's breathing was loud. He leaned closer to the grill, eyes narrowing as he watched my face. "What does it say?" he demanded. I swallowed. The approved phrase rose automatically to my lips. "Your request is denied due to..." He slammed his fist against the grill, rattling it. "Don't speak to me like I'm a child," he snarled. "Tell me why." The hall behind him went quiet, as if the line itself listened. I could have lied. I could have blamed formatting. I could have used the approved phrases to soften the blow. But something in me, stretched thin by stamps and screams, snapped into honesty. "Priority reallocation," I said, voice flat. "Your ammunition has been reassigned, for a heartbeat." The quartermaster looked confused, like a man hearing a foreign language. Then his face twisted, not into rage but into something worse, understanding. "Reassigned," he whispered, as if tasting the word. "To who?" I did not answer. I could not. He let out a sound that might have been a laugh if laughter could drown. He gathered his forms slowly, deliberately, his hands steady in a way that chilled me. Then he turned, pushing back into the crowd. The line began to murmur again, but the murmur was different now, more edged, more hungry. The enforcers shifted uneasily. The compliance adept at my shoulder did not move. He leaned in again. "Do you see?" he murmured. "This is why compassion is inefficiency. It delays the inevitable." When the shift siren finally sounded, it felt like an execution bell. The petitioners did not leave. They were forced back, herded into holding pens, told to return at dawn chimes to begin again. Their eyes followed us as we filed out, clerks in ink, stained robes walking past a sea of hunger and grief, protected by nothing but procedure. As I left, I glanced back through the open doors. The floor was slick in places where blood had been spilled and not properly cleaned. Petition papers lay trampled underfoot, their corners torn, their ink smeared into illegibility. A servitor moved among them with a mop, its blank eyes unfocused, its movements precise, indifferent. It wiped away the evidence of the day as if wiping away sin. I returned to the annex carrying the day's petitions, bundles of desperation made tidy by stamps. My hands shook as I filed them, each one sliding into its slot with a soft, final whisper. The building hummed around me, satisfied. The ledger grew heavier. The living, somewhere beyond the walls, grew lighter. That night in the dormitory, I lay awake listening to the distant murmur of the petitioner's hall through the vents. It sounded like an ocean trapped underground, endlessly pressing against stone. I realized with a slow, sinking dread that the queue would never end because the Imperium did not intend it to. Need was not a problem to solve. It was a resource to manage. And I, with my slate and stamp and number, had become one of its managers. Audit day was announced 3 cycles in advance, which meant 3 cycles of dread stretched thin over every waking hour. The notice arrived as a sealed memo slid into the pneumatic tube above the supervisor's desk, its wax stamped black instead of red. Black meant correction at scale. Black meant lives recalculated. The supervisor read it in silence, his augmetic eyes clicking softly, then posted it on the annex notice board without comment. We gathered around it anyway, as if proximity might grant insight. It did not. The memo was brief, comprehensive inventory verification pending. All clerks present. Non-compliance will be noted. From that moment on, every sound in the annex felt accusatory. The hum of cogitators seemed louder, more impatient. The flicker of the lumen strips felt deliberate, like a blinking eye. I began to double, check entries obsessively, my fingers hovering over the slate as if it might bite. Sleep became shallow and fractured. I dreamed of numbers spilling out of shelves, writhing like worms, impossible to gather back into order. The auditors arrived at the 3rd shift bell on the appointed day. There was no dramatic entrance, no announcement beyond the sudden stillness that rippled through the annex as word spread faster than any vox call. I looked up from my desk and saw them standing at the threshold between Isla's 3, figures in black robes edged with silver script, faces hidden behind sealed respirator masks. Each mask bore a small grill shaped like a skull's mouth, and the faint hiss of filtered air escaped with every breath they took. They carried portable shrines strapped to their chests, metal cases bristling with stamps, seals, and data probes, each one sanctified and terrifying. They did not greet us. They did not need to. Their presence was a verdict already in progress. The clerk supervisor hurried forward, bowing so deeply his hood slipped. He began to speak protocol phrases, assurances of readiness, but the lead auditor raised a gloved hand. The gesture was small, almost polite, and it cut him off completely. Silence fell thick and absolute. "Begin," the auditor said, voice muffled by the respirator but steady, emotionless. It was the voice of someone who had long ago stopped thinking of consequences. They moved methodically, aisle by aisle, desk by desk. Each auditor was accompanied by a servo skull that floated at shoulder height, its lenses whirring softly as it recorded everything. The skull's cables trailed behind them like spinal cords. Where they paused, the air seemed to grow colder. When they reached my desk, my mouth went dry. I stood as instructed, hands clasped behind my back, eyes forward. One auditor remained at the terminal, while another began removing files from my shelves, stacking them on a rolling cart. Each file was scanned, its seal checked, its code cross-referenced against the cogitator's glowing screen. The 3rd auditor watched me, not my work, not the files, but me. I could feel the weight of that attention like a hand pressing between my shoulders. Designation. The terminal auditor said. I recited my number. My voice sounded distant, as if coming from someone else's throat. Function. Intake and requisition processing. I replied. Secondary transcription. The auditor nodded slightly. You have processed approximately 12,000 individual requests this cycle, he said. It was not a question. Your error rate is within acceptable parameters. Relief fluttered weakly in my chest, quickly smothered by the knowledge that acceptable was not the same as safe. They continued. Crate codes, shipment documents, ration allotments. Each item was reduced to a line on the screen, a check mark or a red symbol. Time stretched. Sweat trickled down my spine beneath my robe. I focused on breathing evenly, counting each inhale like a penitent counting prayers. Then the auditor at the terminal paused. The pause was everything. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to a distant sound only he could hear. His gloved fingers hovered over the controls. The watching auditor shifted his weight. "Explain," the terminal auditor said calmly. "The discrepancy in shipment ledger 774 subsection delta." My mind went blank. Ledger 774, subsection delta. I saw it in my head immediately. The page layout, the ink density, the stamp alignment. I had handled it dozens of times. "There is no discrepancy," I said, too quickly. The watching auditor's gaze sharpened. The terminal auditor turned the screen toward me. A single line glowed red. "Les pièces stad SS. UQ entidades 100, rasevid, 1 unit unaccounted for," he said. "Explain." The room seemed to tilt. One last pack. A single power cell among thousands. I remembered the shipment vaguely. A crate damaged in transit. Contents spilled. Counted twice. I remembered adjusting the tolly to match the manifest, because the manifest was supposed to be correct. I remembered thinking it was nothing. I adjusted the count to align with the manifest. I said slowly. The crate was damaged. I believed. Belief is irrelevant. The auditor interrupted. Outcome is irrelevant. The ledger records absence. The word absence echoed in my head, heavy and final. The watching auditor stepped closer. I smelled incense and antiseptic through his respirator. "One missing last pack," he said, almost conversationally. "Can represent theft. Theft represents corruption. Corruption represents sabotage. Sabotage." The word landed like a blow. Sabotage was not a clerical error. Sabotage was treason dressed in numbers. "I did not steal it," I said, my voice barely steady. "I swear." The auditor raised his hand again. "Oaths have already been recorded," he said. "They are not under review." He tapped his data probe against the screen, and the red line pulsed. "Classification options," he continued. "Misfiled documentation, negligent oversight, intentional misallocation, sabotage." Each option appeared on the screen, listed with corresponding penalties. My stomach clenched as my eyes flicked involuntarily to the last column. I did not need to read the details to know what they entailed. I had written similar citations myself. "What is the standard corrective action?" the terminal auditor asked. The clerk supervisor cleared his throat nervously. "For discrepancies under 1%, he said. "Contextual evaluation," the auditor finished for him. "Yes," he turned back to me. "Context," he said, "was provided by pattern." He gestured, and the servo skull projected a series of data points into the air between us: my processing history, my minor delays, my unauthorized transcription of a widow's form. Each inefficiency glowed faintly amber. The compliance adept stood at the edge of the aisle, watching. Our eyes met briefly. His expression was unreadable. "Pattern indicates," the auditor said, "a tendency toward deviation. Deviation invites loss." Loss. The word carried weight here. Loss meant supplies not delivered. Loss meant soldiers without ammunition. Loss meant casualties that would later arrive at my desk as write-offs. "We will not assign sabotage at this time," the auditor concluded. "Misfiled documentation will suffice." My knees nearly buckled with relief. Misfiled documentation was survivable. Painful but survivable, the auditor continued. "Will be enacted to reconcile the ledger." I nodded, swallowing. "I accept correction," I said, the phrase automatic. The auditor pressed a seal onto a small slate and handed it to the supervisor. "1 unit must be reconciled," he said. "Balance must be restored." I knew then what that meant, even before the supervisor's eyes flicked toward the disciplinary sub-office door. 1 las, pack missing meant 1 las, pack must be accounted for. If it could not be found, it would be replaced, not with equipment, but with consequence. The auditors moved on, leaving behind a wake of tension and whispered fear. The annex slowly resumed its hum, but it was a strained sound now. Like machinery running under too much load, I was escorted to a side office to provide a written statement. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single lumen globe that buzzed incessantly. I wrote and rewrote the explanation until my hand cramped, careful to use approved phrasing, careful not to assign blame beyond myself. Each word felt like a nail driven into my own coffin. When I returned to my desk, the supervisor was waiting. He did not look at me. He slid a form across the surface, already filled out. SARECTERENCLIATON or DR under resolution method. A box was checked. RUSORCERELOKDELAO. My mouth went dry. You understand, the supervisor said quietly, still not meeting my eyes. The ledger must balance. I thought of the missing LAS, pack, small, standardized, easily overlooked. I thought of the way auditors spoke of absence as if it were a sin. Somewhere, someone would be reclassified to make the numbers align. A guardsman reassigned without proper equipment, a ration reduced, a medical supply delayed, or a clerk punished. Sign. The supervisor said. My hand shook as I took the quill. The ink looked darker than usual under the buzzing light. I signed. The pen scraped loudly against the slate. The sound seemed to carry, echoing down the aisles. I imagined the ledger absorbing the correction, satisfied once more. That evening, as the auditors departed without farewell, I noticed something new etched into the annex's atmosphere. A sense that the building now knew me more intimately. I had been measured and found wanting. I had been entered into a different column. From that day on, every number I handled felt heavier. Every discrepancy looked like a loaded weapon. I understood now that numbers were not neutral. They were accusations waiting to happen. And audit day had taught me the most important lesson of all in the Imperium. Crime does not begin with intent. It begins with arithmetic. They did not punish me immediately. That was the cruelty of it. The reconciliation order I had signed vanished into the upper offices, and life in the annex continued with the same mechanical indifference as before. But something had changed. I could feel it in the way the cogitators responded more slowly to my inputs, as if weighing my requests before granting them. I could feel it in the compliance, Adept's gaze lingering longer than necessary, his head tilting slightly whenever I hesitated. I had been marked, not condemned, not yet, but annotated, a footnote in a larger ledger. The lesson came in stages, the way all important lessons do in the Imperium. First instruction, then demonstration, then application. I was reassigned to a new duty block under the pretense of professional development. The phrase was stamped at the top of the transfer order in cheerful blue ink that looked obscene against the rest of the document. My new station was deeper in the annex, closer to the sub-vaults where provisional orders were held before final approval. The air there was warmer, thicker, carrying the smell of hot circuitry and old sweat. The lumen strips flickered more violently, casting long, twitching shadows across the shelves. On my first day, the compliance adept met me at the aisle entrance. He carried no slate, no visible tools, only his authority, worn like a second skin. You understand now, he said as we walked, our footsteps echoing. Numbers are fragile things. They must be protected. Yes, I replied. It was easier than explaining the knot in my chest. He stopped beside a terminal and gestured for me to stand close. The screen displayed a shipment manifest for a frontline regiment, filters, rations, medica packs, all approved, all correct. He tapped a single line with his finger. This unit, he said, has exceeded its projected survival window. I frowned despite myself. Survival window. He glanced at me. You have seen the casualty projections. You know how they are calculated. This unit is statistically dead. Continuing to supply them at full allocation is wasteful. Wasteful. The word slid easily from his mouth. The supplies are already allocated, I said carefully. The forms are approved. Approval, he replied, is conditional. Everything is conditional. He entered a command into the terminal. The line on the screen changed color, shifting from green to amber. A new note appeared beside it, pinned and verification. Verification of what? I asked. Relevance, he said. He turned to me fully then, his augmetic eye whirring softly as it adjusted. This is how you burn paper, he continued. You do not destroy it, you delay it. You let it age. You let it become obsolete. The supplies would not arrive on time. Filters delayed meant poisoned air. Medica packs delayed meant untreated wounds. Rations delayed meant weakness. All without a single overt denial. All perfectly within regulation. I felt sick. Over the next cycles, he showed me more. How to misroute a shipment by altering a single digit in a transit code. How to flag a requisition for sanctity review, knowing full well that the review queue was months long. How to LOS a form in secondary filing so that it technically existed, but could not be acted upon. Paper is patient, he told me. People are not. The first time he ordered me to do it myself, my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the stamp. The requisition was for power cells. Standard issue. The unit designation was one I recognized from the casualty reports: high attrition, ongoing engagement. The order was urgent. Mark it. The compliance adept said softly. With what? I asked, though I already knew. Pending verification, he replied. Categoried. Logistical inconsistency. There is no inconsistency, I said. My voice sounded thin even to me. He leaned closer. I smelled incense again. Strong enough to sting my eyes. There will be, he said, after you mark it. I stared at the form. The paper was rough beneath my fingers, the ink still slightly raised. Somewhere, a quartermaster had filled this out under fire, probably by lumen light, probably believing, foolishly, that doing it correctly would save lives. My training screamed at me to comply. My body wanted to flee. My mind searched desperately for some third option that did not exist. I stamped the form. The sound was final, a dull thud that seemed to reverberate through my bones. Pen di verifiti, the compliance adept nodded. Good, he said. You are learning. That night I dreamed of fire, not the bright, cleansing kind depicted in shrine murals, but slow, smoldering flames that crept along shelves of paper, curling edges, blackening ink, until words became unreadable. In the dream, the flames made no sound, they simply consumed. The consequences arrived weeks later, as consequences always do, filtered through layers of abstraction until they are almost unrecognizable as cause and effect. The casualty reports crossed my desk during a routine filing shift. Unit designation matched the requisition I had delayed. Losses were severe: respiratory failure, untreated wounds, ammunition shortages leading to close quarters engagements with unacceptable casualty ratios. I stared at the numbers, my throat tight. Each figure felt personal, though none of the names were listed, just totals, percentages, projections. I imagined the missing power cells like ghosts, hovering just out of reach. In the margins of the report, another clerk, perhaps, had written a small notation in red: KUSE SUPPLWay delay. My stomach lurched. I reported it to the compliance adept, my voice low. The delay, it caused losses. He looked at the report, then at me. Losses were projected, he said. The delay merely aligned reality with expectation. He handed the report back. File it. Something broke then, not loudly, not cleanly. Just a small internal fracture that made it easier to breathe while doing terrible things. The next burn came quicker. An audit adjustment required, personnel reconciliation, to offset material loss elsewhere. I was instructed to draft the correction orders. The forms were cold, impersonal, filled with phrases like Rasoa Afediuhiemian Ssitirealokian. I wrote them carefully, my handwriting precise, my stamps aligned. As I worked, I realized what I was truly doing. The missing las, packed from my own discrepancy, so small, so insignificant, had set this chain in motion. To make the numbers align, people were being erased, reassigned, starved, or killed, not because anyone hated them, not because anyone wished them harm, but because the ledger demanded balance. The ink on the correction orders looked thick and dark, pooling slightly at the edges of the letters. Under the lumen glare, it reminded me of coagulating blood. I signed the final page with a steady hand. Afterward, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the blank surface. The annex hummed around me, satisfied. Somewhere far away, I knew, a platoon would go without filters. Somewhere else, a wounded soldier would die waiting for medicare supplies that existed only on paper. Bureaucracy, I understood now, is a blade you never see until it is already in your gut. It cuts at a distance. It leaves no fingerprints. And once you learn how to wield it, the temptation to keep cutting is constant, because stopping would mean facing what you have already done. When I finally stood to leave, my reflection in the darkened terminal screen startled me. My eyes looked older, harder. The number around my neck gleamed dully in the flickering light. I had burned paper. And through it, I had burned people. The war announced itself long before it reached the walls. It came first as a vibration, a low, ceaseless thrum that seeped into the Munitorum through the stone and steel like a second pulse layered beneath my own. Conveyor chains rattled day and night now. Servo haulers groaned under heavier loads, and somewhere far below the annex the manufactorum furnaces roared without pause. Even the lumen strips seemed to flicker in time with the distant artillery, as if the building itself were flinching. The supply halls filled beyond capacity. Crates were stacked in eisels meant for people, labeled with hazard runes and priority sigils that contradicted one another. The air was hot and metallic, tasting of propellant residue and ozone. Every surface felt grimy to the touch, a thin film of dust and ash settling faster than the servitors could clean it. The smell of incense grew stronger, burned in greater quantities to sanctify the flow of material, to convince the machines, and perhaps ourselves, that this was still holy work. It was during this escalation that the dead began arriving at my desk, not bodies. Not at first. They came as tags, thin plasteel identifiers stamped with serial numbers and unit codes, attached to casualty reports like afterthoughts. Each report was a neat rectangle of data, STAUSN. DCAPMNT dummy EFF RAPVT requiest per DNG. The language was precise, bloodless. The first time I processed one, I paused only long enough to note the efficiency. Death had been reduced to a workflow. Soon there were dozens, then hundreds. I learned the rhythm of it. Morning shifts brought fresh casualty tallies from overnight engagements. Mid-cycle brought updates, revised numbers, adjusted projections. By the end of the shift, replacement requests arrived: boots for the living, body bags for the dead, ammunition for positions that would soon require more tags. The corpses themselves passed through other channels, but occasionally the system hiccuped. A refrigeration unit failed. A transport was delayed. When that happened, the supply halls took on a new smell, sweet, cloying, unmistakable. Servitors were rerouted to deal with it, their augmetic limbs fitted with cutting tools and hooks. I tried not to watch them pass, dragging wrapped shapes toward the processing lifts. At my desk, the dead were abstractions. But abstraction does not mean invisibility. Patterns emerged, insidious and familiar. Certain unit codes appeared again and again. Certain supply delays preceded spikes in casualty figures with horrifying regularity. I began to recognize them the way others recognize faces. This regiment starved, that one suffocated. Another bled out waiting for Medicare packs that had been rerouted for sanctity priority. It hollowed me out. I still did my work. In some ways, I did it better than ever. My stamps were clean, my filing impeccable. I anticipated shortages before they appeared, because I had learned how the system strangled units quietly. Efficiency, after all, is rewarded. But sometimes, rarely, dangerously, I broke protocol in small ways. In the margins of casualty reports, I began to write things that were not permitted. Never names. Names were traceable. Just fragments, confessions. Arrived too late. No filters. Bled out during evacuation delay. Once, beside a particularly brutal tally, I wrote "I remember you," even if the docket does not. The ink looked thinner there, as if ashamed of itself. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was evidence, but it felt necessary, like pressing a finger into a wound just to prove you were still alive. The compliance adept noticed eventually. He always did. He appeared at my desk one cycle, while I was processing a stack of casualty write-offs. His presence announced only by the sudden absence of ambient noise. I felt it before I saw him, a tightening in the air. "You have been annotating," he said mildly. My heart stuttered. "Clarifying," I replied, choosing the word carefully. He picked up a report and turned it slightly, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on the margin. He read the line silently. "Memory," he said after a moment, "is not a recognized logistical function." I began, then stopped myself. Thinking was not a defense. He set the report down gently. "Do you know why we reduce them to numbers?" he asked. "So the scale can be managed," I said automatically. "So the guilt can be," he corrected. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If you remember them as people, you will hesitate. Hesitation introduces error. Error introduces loss. Loss." Always that word. He did not reprimand me. That was worse. Instead, he smiled, a small, tight expression that did not reach his eyes. "Erase the annotations," he said. "Then process this." He slid a new file across the desk. It was a write-off for rations. Thousands of units marked consumed. The accompanying note "Reupntis dikis PRAO TO URUHON rations for the dead." My stomach churned. "They will not be redistributed." The compliance adept continued. Contamination risk. You will approve disposal. Disposal meant incineration. Perfectly good food burned because it had been assigned to bodies that no longer needed it. Somewhere else, I knew, petitioners were being denied emergency ration increases for lack of availability. I stamped the disposal order. The ink smeared slightly. I did not correct it. As the war intensified, the annex became a place of constant motion and constant stillness at once. Crates moved faster. Data flowed quicker. But the human element, clerks like me, grew quieter, more withdrawn. We spoke only when required, and then only in approved phrases. I noticed several desks go empty, replaced by servitors with fresh augmetics and blank efficiency. At one such desk I recognized the handwriting on a casualty report. A clerk I had trained alongside, reassigned weeks earlier. His designation appeared under STTSDDSD, his cause of death listed as ESTNDECIDENT. I processed the write-off myself, my hands numb. The distant artillery grew louder. Ammunition requests spiked, then began to fluctuate erratically as redirections multiplied. Priority orders conflicted with sanctity orders. Sanctity orders conflicted with survival projections. The system strained under its own contradictions, and the solution, always, was subtraction. I approved ammunition shipments to unnamed units, designations scrubbed, destinations classified. I denied ammunition to units with clear identifiers because their projected survival window had expired. Ammunition for the unnamed. Silence for the known. One report crossed my desk late in the cycle, flagged urgent. It detailed a failed defensive stand, casualties near total. In the analysis section, a single line stood out: PRA Marwa Fafitioramuensu AG. I traced the unit code back through the system. I found the requisition. I found my own stamp. I did not write in the margin this time. I could not. Instead, I closed the file and filed it where it belonged. The ledger absorbed it without comment. That night, as I left the annex, I passed a shrine alcove newly erected in the corridor. Candles flickered before a relief carving depicting soldiers advancing beneath a banner of purity. At the base of the shrine was a box labeled Dione Tiansfar Ta Felen. It was empty. I stood there for a long time, listening to the distant thunder of war through the walls, feeling the weight of everything I had approved, denied, delayed, and destroyed. The Imperium did not mourn. It recorded, it replaced, it moved on, and I, who had once hesitated over a single last pack, now processed death by the thousand without pause. The annotations in my margins were gone, scrubbed clean, but the memories were not. They piled up inside me, unfiled, unprocessed, an internal backlog that no stamp could resolve. I understood then that the war was not just fought on battlefields or in the void. It was fought here, in ink and ration counts and redirections. And here, too, people died quietly, efficiently, unnamed. The transfer order arrived without ceremony, as all truly dangerous things do. It was slipped into my tray between casualty summaries and ammunition forecasts. Its header stamped with the sigil of internal correction. The paper was heavier than standard stock, treated with some chemical that made it resist creasing, as if even the document itself refused to bend. I knew what it meant the moment I saw the destination code. Disciplinary sub-office. The annex had always been oppressive, but the sub-office existed in a different register of suffering. It was not a place meant to move supplies or data efficiently. It was meant to break patterns, to grind deviation down until nothing remained but compliance. The corridor leading to it sloped downward, the stone walls narrowing as if the building itself were drawing in its breath. The air changed as I descended, sharper, cleaner, heavy with disinfectant layered over something organic and unpleasant. Incense burned here too, but it was thicker, cloying, mixed with oils used to preserve flesh and metal alike. The lumen strips were fewer and brighter, their light harsh and unforgiving, leaving nowhere for shadows to hide. The first thing I noticed was the sound, not screaming. The Imperium is far too refined for that. It was the scratching, hundreds of pens, styluses, and quills moving across paper at once, a dry, relentless rasp that filled the space like the whisper of insects. It seeped into my skull and nested there. Even now, I hear it when I close my eyes. Rows of desks filled the chamber, arranged with ritual precision. At each sat a clerk, men and women I recognized from the annex, from training cohorts, from audit aftermaths. Some were shackled to their chairs by one wrist or ankle, the restraints built into the furniture itself. Others wore restraint collars with thin cables trailing upward into the ceiling, disappearing into systems I did not want to understand. All of them were writing. They copied correction notices, the same notice, over and over. Their faces were slack with exhaustion, eyes rimmed red and unfocused. Fingers were wrapped in blood-stained cloth, ink mixing with darker smears on the paper. A few mouths moved silently, lips forming the words they wrote as if reciting a penance. No one spoke aloud. Speech was inefficient. I was assigned a desk near the center. No restraints, not yet. That, I understood, was intentional. Trust extended just far enough to be withdrawn later. A disciplinary overseer approached, a thin figure in layered robes, face hidden behind a mask of polished steel etched with devotional text. His voice emerged through a Vox grill, distorted and flat. "You are here," he said, "to assist in corrective throughput." "Yes," I replied. "You will draft punishment citations," he continued. "You will ensure accuracy. You will ensure permanence." He gestured to a stack of slates at my desk. Each bore a designation number, a summary of deviation, and a blank section labeled AUT or IVAFETON. I understood immediately what this was. The confessional ledger. Clerks like me were not sent here to be punished alone. We were sent to participate, to learn the cost of error by inflicting it, carefully and correctly, on others. The first slate detailed a minor discrepancy, delayed filing, 2 minutes beyond authorized, shift end. The approved corrective action options were listed beneath. I selected the lowest tier, extended labor shift, sleep reduction. My hand moved smoothly, too smoothly. The overseer nodded. Proceed. As the hours passed, the deviations grew more severe. Unauthorized transcription, repeated hesitation, marginal notation, emotional irregularity. Each slate represented a person seated somewhere in the chamber, scratching away at their punishment in real time. One citation required physical reinforcement. The approved language was cold and exact, describing voltage, duration, and frequency. I signed it. Somewhere to my left, a clerk stiffened as the collar around her neck pulsed. She made a small sound, more breath than voice, and then resumed writing. The smell changed as the day wore on. Sweat, blood, hot metal. Disinfectant reapplied over and over, never quite erasing what lay beneath. The incense thickened until it coated the back of my throat, making swallowing painful. At regular intervals, the scratching would stop. An overseer would walk the aisles, inspecting work. If a copied notice contained an error, a misspelled word, a misaligned stamp, the clerk responsible was removed. Not dragged, not beaten. Simply detached from their desk and led through a side door. A servitor would take their place before the scratching resumed. No one ever returned from that door. During a brief sanctioned pause, I caught the eye of a man across from me. His hair had gone grey since I last saw him in the annex. His hands shook uncontrollably, ink splattering the page. He mouthed a single word at me. "Help." I looked away. That was when I understood the true function of the sub-office. It was not just about punishment. It was about complicity. You could endure suffering inflicted from above and still imagine yourself innocent. But once you had signed the order, once your stamp had made pain official, you belonged to the system in a deeper, more irreversible way. Every seal I pressed felt like a thumbprint on my soul. The prayers etched into the walls began to make sense then. They were not pleas for mercy. They were warnings. By the end of the cycle, my fingers ached, my eyes burned, and my chest felt hollow. I had drafted dozens of citations. I had reduced human agony to standardized phrasing. I had learned the weight of different punishments, the way a merchant learns the heft of coin. When release was finally granted, it was signaled not by a siren but by silence. The scratching stopped. Pens were set down in unison. The overseers nodded, satisfied. As I stood to leave, I noticed a new slate waiting on my desk, my designation number, no deviation listed yet, just a blank space waiting. The overseer noticed my gaze. "All records are provisional," he said calmly. "Even yours." I walked back up the corridor on unsteady legs, the scratching fading behind me, but never truly leaving my ears. The annex felt different when I returned, lighter, almost kind by comparison. That terrified me more than anything else. I had learned how discipline truly functioned in the Imperium. Not as correction, but as cultivation. Pain carefully applied, evenly distributed, until obedience grew naturally from fear and exhaustion. And I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my gut, that the ledger had not finished with me. The worst shortages were not sudden. They never are. Sudden loss invites questions, audits, and corrective attention. The worst shortages arrived quietly, wrapped in procedure and stamped with authority so absolute that resistance felt childish. By the time anyone noticed, it was already too late to change anything without admitting fault, and admission was the one resource the Imperium refused to spend. I was back in the annex when the order arrived, returned from the disciplinary sub-office with my posture straighter and my thoughts carefully trimmed of unnecessary excess. The war pressed closer now. The vibration beneath the floors had become a constant tremor, as if the hive itself were being shaken by an unseen hand. Casualty tallies rose faster than replacement requests could follow. The system was stretched thin, and thin systems cut deep. The order appeared on my slate without preamble, flag ABC period and locked against alteration. Ride East TSAODOMEOCAS GMA, Eferaman tia Ishtera UTI Tio San TFED Storage Breach Bureau ODF Sanj TAY. I stared at it for a long time, rereading the words until they blurred. Sanctified storage meant shrine vaults, vast repositories of blessed material reserved for ceremonial defense, relic protection, and contingencies that never seemed to arrive. Ammunition sent there would sit behind sealed doors, guarded by prayer and doctrine, while guns at the front went silent. I pulled up the shipment details. Enough shells to sustain a defensive line for days. Enough power cells to keep heavy weapons firing through the night. I cross-referenced casualty projections automatically, my mind now trained to see the future in percentages and curves. The numbers updated as soon as I applied the redirection simulation. Projected casualties spiked. It was not subtle. The system did not attempt to soften the truth. Entire units dropped below survivability thresholds. Defensive positions collapsed in neat, clinical graphs. The cold arithmetic of doomed hours unfolded before me. Each tick forward another loss accounted for in advance. My throat tightened. I requested clarification. The reply came swiftly, curt and final. Sen sui aweval morashie sesera, kyom pie dienciesamid. I sat back, heart pounding, listening to the hum of the annex. Around me, clerks worked on, unaware, or pretending to be. The ledger did not scream. It did not argue. It waited. I could have processed the order without comment. That was the expectation. That was the path of least resistance. But something in me, perhaps the last remnant of the person who had once hesitated over a guardsman's boots, refused to let it pass without friction. I stood and walked to my supervisor's desk. He looked up as I approached, his augmetic eyes clicking softly. "Yes?" he asked. I held up the slate. "This redirection," I said carefully. "If enacted, frontline units will exhaust ammunition within hours." "Yes," he replied. "There is no replacement shipment scheduled," I continued. "No mitigation." "Yes," I swallowed. "They will be overrun." He studied me for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached into a locked drawer beneath his desk. The sound of the lock disengaging was quiet, precise. He removed a thin folder and placed it on the desk between us. He did not push it toward me. He did not need to. My designation number was stamped on the cover. "Your file," he said. My hands felt numb as I opened it. Inside were notes, observations, minor delays logged during petition intake, marginal hesitations during audits, unauthorized transcription flagged and contextualized, time spent in disciplinary sub-office, psychological compliance indicators. One line underlined in red stood out. UMPROD. My mouth went dry. "You see," the supervisor said quietly, "why this decision is not open to discussion." I looked up at him. "If I refuse?" He did not smile. "Then the ledger will rebalance elsewhere." I understood what he was saying. Refusal would not save the units. The ammunition would still be redirected. The only difference would be where the corrective action landed. On me, or on someone like me. The choice was simple in the way a noose is simple. Complete, or become an example to correct others. I returned to my desk on legs that felt foreign, unreliable. The slate waited, patient. I entered the authorization code. a final confirmation prompt appeared. I hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then I pressed yes. The system accepted the command. The shipment rerouted. The numbers settled into their new configuration, balanced and correct. Somewhere far away, guns fell silent. The silence did not arrive as a sound, of course. I did not hear explosions stop or engines die. I saw it later in the reports. Defensive fire reduced, positions abandoned, casualties listed as overemission exa. That phrase would haunt me. The next shifts passed in a blur. The annex was busier than ever, processing the aftermath of decisions like mine. Replacement requests flooded in, too late. Casualty tags piled up. The system churned, indifferent to the human scale of what it had done. I processed write-offs mechanically, my movements precise, my mind curiously calm. There was a numbness in me now, a quiet that felt dangerously like peace. Perhaps this was what full compliance felt like, the absence of internal resistance. During a brief lull, I opened a casualty report tied directly to the redirected shipment. Unit designation matched. Losses were near total. In the notes section, a single line caught my eye. Frenes mesio reivivadiamo guendi, hiridiimdi biladis. I closed the file. I did not annotate it. I did not confess in the margins. I filed it where it belonged. That was when I knew there was nothing left in me to save. The Imperium had not broken me in a moment of spectacular cruelty. It had worn me down, decision by decision, until I could sign away lives with the same detached efficiency I once applied to inventory counts. The ledger did not need monsters. It needed clerks willing to accept inevitability. At the end of the cycle, as I prepared to log out, a new notification appeared on my slate. Rekla Sifki Iompendiangi, Rapioti Openakirasi Oradia 80 next CFT. I stared at the words, feeling no surprise at all. Somewhere in a shrine vault, ammunition sat untouched, sanctified and useless. Somewhere else, bodies cooled on battlefields that no longer mattered to the numbers. And I, who had stamped the order that made it so, was finally being balanced out of the system. I am writing this because the forms are finished. That is how the thought comes to me now, not as fear, not as regret, but as a simple statement of status. The ledger is complete. The last entries have been stamped, verified, archived. My designation has been removed from active duty rosters and transferred to a different column entirely. The system is tidy again, balanced. They notified me at the start of shift, not with a summons but with an update. My slate chimed once, polite, unobtrusive, and displayed a reclassification notice in neutral gray text. Skili ntnu tfir lili adj ust minrequa direpapiro cc incarod. No explanation. None was needed. I cleared my desk carefully. Not because it was required. Everything at the Munitorum belongs to the Munitorum, but because habit is hard to kill. I aligned my stamp parallel to the desk edge. I wiped excess ink from my slate. I returned the chair to its approved position. The number around my neck felt heavier than usual, cold against my skin. As I walked through the annex one last time, I noticed how little it noticed me. The cogitators hummed on, servitors shuffled past, arms full of data, slates and sealed crates. Clerks bent over their desks, eyes fixed on screens, hands moving with practiced efficiency. No one looked up. No one said goodbye. I could have been erased already, and the workflow would not have stuttered. The processing corridor lay beyond the disciplinary sub-office, deeper than I had ever gone. The walls there were smoother, the stone polished by generations of hands and machines. The air was thick with sacred oils, heavy and cloying, making each breath feel deliberate. Incense burned in recessed alcoves, its smoke curling upward to vanish into vents shaped like aquila wings. Hymns played softly through hidden vox speakers, their cadence slow and reassuring, as if meant to calm livestock before slaughter. I followed the floor markings, yellow lines denoting approved movement paths, until I reached a checkpoint staffed by two figures in red, edged robes. Their faces were obscured by rebreather masks etched with script. One of them scanned my designation plate. The other checked a slate. "Steady hands," he said, reading aloud. "High tolerance for repetition, proven compliance under stress." He looked up at me. "You will continue to serve." I nodded. There was nothing else to do. They took my slate first. Then my stamp. Each removal felt like the amputation of a limb I had forgotten was artificial. Finally, they removed the number from my neck. For a brief, disorienting moment, I felt weightless, unclassified. Then they replaced it with a new identifier, heavier, bolted rather than hung. I did not look at the designation. I did not want to know it. The corridor narrowed as I progressed, the light growing brighter, harsher. The hymns grew louder, layered with the hiss of steam and the distant whine of cutting tools. I passed doors marked with symbols I recognized from requisition catalogs, augmetic components, neural interfaces, restraint harnesses. The smell of hot metal joined the incense, sharp and biting. At the threshold of the processing chamber, I was instructed to undress. The floor was cold beneath my feet. My clothes, ink-stained robes, worn boots, were taken away and placed in a bin labeled Selvidil Materials. I wondered, briefly, who would wear them next. Another clerk. Another number. The chamber itself was vast, circular, its ceiling lost in shadow. Mechanical arms hung from tracks overhead, each fitted with tools that gleamed dully in the light. Servitors stood in alcoves along the walls, inert for now, their forms a patchwork of flesh and machine. I recognized some of them, faces from the annex, from the disciplinary sub-office. Clerks who had copied one error too many. They seated me in a restraint chair at the center of the room. The metal was cold against my back, the clamps firm but not cruel. A harness settled over my shoulders and spine, heavy and precise. A robed figure approached, carrying a data slate and a small sensor trailing smoke. "You are not being punished," he said, as if that mattered. "You are being optimized." He read from the slate. "Cognitive functions related to enumeration, verification, and compliance will be preserved. Redundant emotional processing will be minimized. Physical components deemed unnecessary for assigned task will be removed. Removed, not destroyed, not lost, removed like a misfiled document." I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg. I wanted to confess everything I had done, every stamp, every delay, every life I had helped erase. Instead, I lay still, because I understood, finally, that none of that mattered. The Imperium did not judge morality, it measured utility, and I had proven useful, just not as a man. The saws began. They did not rush. There was no need. Each incision was deliberate, accompanied by murmured litanies and the steady beep of monitoring cogitators. Pain flared, white and consuming, then receded as suppressants flooded my system. My body became distant, an object being worked upon. As they fitted augmetic interfaces along my spine, I felt a strange clarity. Memories surfaced unbidden. The first stamp I ever pressed. The guardsman with the wrong unit code. The widow's annotated form. The quartermaster's hollow laugh. The redirection order. The silence in the crate. All of it led here. "You will not remember these things," the robed figure said gently, adjusting a cable at the base of my skull. "They are inefficient." I wanted to tell him that memory was the only thing that had ever made the work bearable. That forgetting was the final cruelty. But my jaw no longer responded. The last thing they did was connect me to the network, to the ledger, to the endless flow of numbers that defined the Imperium's will. Data flooded in, clean and precise, pushing everything else aside. As my vision dimmed, I had one final treasonous thought. The Imperium does not reward loyalty. It consumes it, records the consumption, and files the record in triplicate. If this confession survives, if some fragment of me remains in the margins of a system too vast to notice, let it be my final shipment, one unapproved truth smuggled past the stamp before I am fully, perfectly, and forever processed.